Paulina.
Hey Megan!
What book are we going to talk about today?
Today we're going to talk about The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail by Jason DeLeon. This is another book in our theme, What is the Impact of Archaeological Data on Modern Human Society? Could you give us like a one sentence summary of this book, Megan?
Nope, can't use the sentence I thought of first. First thing I thought of was Texas Border Patrol are assholes.
It rhymes.
Yeah. One sentence. You know
Mm-hmm.
what? No, I'm going to go with that. Uh, oh, that's hard. This is a hard one.
Yeah.
Um, because whatever sentence you choose really centers who the discussion becomes about.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess so. This was another book that I had a hard time with. Even though actually Jason De Leon was one of my first archaeology professors way back when I was a little youngin. And this was actually a project that he talked about when I was in class with him. And so the description that I gave is or that I have prepared um, is an examination of the U.S. policy of prevention through deterrence, um, or oh, that has failed. That has failed. That's what it is. The examination of the U.S. policy of prevention through deterrence that has failed. And I think you could also probably, as you mentioned, how we describe this really centers who then this book becomes about.
yeah.
Um, and that's such an important aspect of both this work and We Keep the Dead Close is who are we centering in this narrative, that I would also say is also it's a story about the people that this policy has failed
Mhm.
on both sides of the United States and Mexico border. That this book is really an examination of the humans who have been failed by the who have been failed by this policy, either by killing them, by separating families, but also by harming bigger aspects of what sort of cultural diversity I think could mean in those areas of the United States and the whole concept of borders as they exist now. Let's get
Content warning, there's a lot in this book. There's death, there is child death, there is trauma, there is um, politics. Uh, there, this is a hard read.
Yeah.
Um, it's a hard read. I saw a presentation that the author gave about this at I think it must have been the SA. I don't know if it was at SA or SAJ several years ago, uh,
Mhm.
and and I remember at the end of the presentation having really conflicting feelings because on the one hand, um, I was like, this is horrible, and it was so hard to sit through the presentation, um, and to talk about suffering and trauma in such a technical archaeological way, but
Mhm.
also the way that the the author at that point, the presenter, talked about the project was so uplifting for me in terms of the things that archaeology can be capable of,
Mhm.
and the ways that archaeology, and I guess this gets to like why the book is in the theme that we've chosen for it.
Yeah.
The ways that archaeology really can work um, to promote change and uh, to showcase the best of people, and also to highlight issues in society that need to be addressed. Um,
Yeah.
Hard
I
book.
guess. Yeah. Were there as I've also mentioned, I've heard about this development of this project for quite a while, and sort of have followed it off and on since I first heard about the project. But from the book specifically, Megan, were there any particular things that stood out to you that you want to talk about?
Um, Well, I mean, the first thing is that I found myself uh, frequently being filled with absolutely incandescent rage, um, because I think a lot of the I lived in yeah, spoiler alert, I lived in Texas for a long time. So um, a lot of the ways in which the public perception of migrants and asylum seekers is framed is, I think, very incorrect and very dangerous. And I wish that I could give this book to lots of lawmakers and tell them, like, look, this is the human suffering that your policy has caused.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think that people, even as someone who is aware of what was happening and what is still happening
Mm-hmm.
at the southern border, um, I the reality of it is so much grimmer and so much more suffering than I it just fills me up with rage and sadness and a feeling of absolute despair at my inability to do anything to resolve the situation.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, as I said, I had a hard time with this book, um, but because of that, I have very specific things to recount from it. And the beginning of the book is very hard. It's very hard. Spoiler alert: dead body, trauma. Um, but that story that De Leon recounts at the very beginning of the book is so impactful for so many reasons. So basically, the beginning of the book, as I said, spoiler and content warning. Um, the author describes the unfortunately the first time that he comes across a dead body. And as archaeologists, we are familiar with interacting with the dead, but usually they are not people that we have seen or talked to in the few days preceding. And he recounts how his shock at seeing this dead body, this unfortunately this first one on this project, and he's talking with some of his informants about it, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" And for me, they're like, he's like, "Hey, that guy is dead. He's right there. You can see him. He's dead. That is a human that we saw." And it's this full emotional reaction from the author. And the people that he's talking to have experienced so much trauma and so much fear and pain that one of his informants will go, "People won't remember tomorrow." And for me, that framing of that story as the beginning is such an important story as in part of this larger narrative, because it's such a great, it's emblematic of the problem. We see this one shot of true pain, true suffering, and then we're set up in our American culture to almost immediately forget about it. And I think I'm hoping, at least, and this is that the book kind of explores how we force ourselves basically to remember, but not to lose that humanizing aspect of it. And I just felt that that first story in the book will really set you up as to whether or not you can keep reading.
yeah.
I could not. Um, but it's so emblematic of like the work that we have to do to remember, and remember with intention when we want to address these problems. That if this is something that you feel passionate about changing, you have to keep yourself healthy and safe, and have the energy to keep coming back to really hard moments over and over and over again. I guess with that, Megan, were there any particular moments or stories or things that De Leon recounted in the book that stood out for you? And I would be also really interested to hear if there were any aspects of the book that made you feel hopeful.
There was one situation that he talks about where they were basically, they had come upon an area that was effectively shrines, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and how and this place felt both sad and hopeful because it was commemorating deaths, but it was also about made by people who had gotten that far, and how there was a moment of safety that immediately went away, um, in this in a situation where being there could have been dangerous for them, apart from being in the larger environment. Which is that's it's a very hard thing to describe without just detailing exactly what happened. But I found that to be really, I think, an important part of the book. The idea that that this practice, and this systemic violence that the U.S. government is perpetuating against, um, people, humans, um, that it is part environment and it is part human, and that none of it needs to exist. That this is a thing that could be, resolved, and that there's so many kinds of fears associated with it, that just when you think, when you're reading through the book, that you understand what are the things that are dangerous, it throws something else at you that's also
Mm-hmm.
dangerous. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there were points where I thought I was going to have to stop reading. Um, I used to teach in, North Texas, and I taught, predominantly, um, Hispanic and Latino population, and I had a lot of kids who had made the trek one way or another, and I never really touched on that with them because I didn't feel like it was my place to talk to them about that. And I I had a hard time at some points in the book where I had to stop and put it down because all I could do was think about my students, my babies, and how lucky they were to get through and to get where they are, and uh, how that must have influenced them in ways that I didn't understand and that I will never understand. Um, and there were also a lot of moments where I was like, um, had a lot of white woman guilt reading it, because even in those moments where I was thinking about those things, it was difficult not to center myself in thinking about how I thought about the situation. Um, and I think to a certain degree that that's some of that is just human, that we try to put ourselves in the position of understanding through our own experiences. But I think if we did a little bit less putting ourselves in that experience and a little bit more actually doing something about it, it would be better for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
I think also we can sometimes forget when we are trying to comprehend such impossible to comprehend violence and trauma, that we try to relate it to ourselves to understand, but it's also so it can be very difficult to hear,
yeah,
as well. That sort of compassionate listening can also be something that is very hard. I have heard that sometimes, unfortunately, when one recounts trauma, one is also, to a certain degree, accepting that you might be traumatizing the person that you are recounting it to.
yeah,
And I think that that's an important aspect to consider. But I think doing is such an important thing, and listening and being open to that compassionate listening about these things, so that we are making choices or doing actions that actually help solve the problem, rather than other sorts of symptoms of it. We've already talked at the beginning this time about how the book fits our theme, which is what is the impact of archaeological data on modern human society. And of course, just to mention, Jason De Leon is a sort of classically trained archaeologist. I think his PhD was on like blades in the Mexica region or something like that. But he is and he applies sort of formal archaeological methods to this discussion. Um, However, to discuss or extend some of the conversations in this book, or maybe if people have a hard time exploring the themes in this, are there any recommendations that you would give for either further reading or in lieu of reading for this particular book?
I would say an interesting avenue, and there's a lot of people who are writing about this concept right now, is the idea of the archaeology of the Anthropocene, which is of the like immediate modern and the impact of humans uh, on the world currently, right now, and going into the future. There's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on in that area, which are very archaeological, but most people don't tend to think of archaeology as being something of the present or of the future. So I think that would be interesting for folks. Um, if you want to get involved in things, if you read this and you're like, I need to do better, I would suggest that you look into organizations that are providing aid at the border as alternative to governmental assistance. Um, there are a number of organizations which, for a variety of reasons, I'm not going to say in here, but there are people who are trying to do good, and it's not hard to find them. Give them your time, give them your money, um, give them your, highlight them where you can. Um, so
Definitely. Um, One, if you want to learn a little bit more about the policies that are directly addressed in this and the histories of those, as well as I think probably the histories of some of the fears that go into the fact that we even that the United States government even has this policy. I would recommend Erica Lee's America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. The last section is explores sort of migration policy as well as Islamophobia. But that if the policy stuff you want to see where did this come from, that book really centers how we even got to this point and why we got to this point. And they didn't have to it didn't have to be this way.
did not.
Um,
This was a
and also,
choice.
um, as part of ongoing work with this project, Jason De Leon has a museum exhibit that is in various places across the US. And I think even there's either an online version or an international version. I believe it is called Hostile Terrain. And it is a really cool project. So if you're interested in seeing where this is at this point in time or contributing either your time, your money, or hosting a hostile terrain exhibit, you can check that out online. So with that, thank you so much, Megan, for sharing your experience with this book. And I hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day.
You too.